Right now, at this very second, there is an invisible digital arms race happening literally right underneath our noses. We rely on our banking apps, our digital identities, our smartphones more than ever before, right? But what happens when the exact mechanisms built to keep those systems secure are flipped and turned against us? In today's Explainer, we're going to unpack how virtual devices are basically industrializing financial crime. And more importantly, what the financial sector is actually doing to fight back. Okay, let's dive into this. What if a hacker didn't actually need your physical phone to steal your money? Honestly, it's a terrifying thought, but it is the absolute reality of modern fraud. We all kind of grew up thinking that for a criminal to hack into our digital lives, they had to pickpocket our smartphone or steal our laptop. But what if they could just magically clone it from halfway across the world? Modern fraud absolutely does not require physical theft anymore. It really just requires the right software. So, here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the double-edged sword of emulation, look at how these virtual devices are weaponized, and then break down the economics of scale. After that, we'll get into building a resilient defense, and finally, how to fight fire with fire. Let's kick things off with Section 1, the double-edged sword, where legitimate tech meets criminal enterprise. Now, the most fascinating and maybe the most frustrating part about this technology is that it was never actually built for criminals. It was built for software developers. It's your classic dual-use tech that's just been completely hijacked. So what is an emulator? Well, it's basically software that acts as a perfectly controllable clone of a physical smartphone. IBM Trusteer notes that it mimics the whole shebang: the device type, the manufacturer, the exact screen size, the GPS location, and even the nuances of how a human touches the screen. If you're building an app and need to test how it looks across the Samsung Galaxy and an iPhone without buying hundreds of physical phones, you use an emulator. And this brilliantly illustrates the core problem we're facing. You've got a completely legitimate developer tool on one side and industrialized criminal abuse on the other. For devs, standard Android tools are absolutely essential for making sure an app works smoothly. But for a criminal enterprise, an emulator offers repeatable, completely concealed, and incredibly low-cost automation. Fraudsters are literally taking these exact same virtual environments to mass create fake accounts and automate cyber-enabled money movement, all while keeping their true identity and location totally hidden. Which brings us to Section 2, weaponizing virtual devices, and exactly how criminals exploit our trust. So how do fraudsters take a standard dev tool and use it to completely dismantle a bank's security architecture? Well, it boils down to exploiting trust. When a bank lets you open an account remotely on an app, they're making some massive trust assumptions. They assume the device you're holding is real, the camera feed is genuine, and a real, breathing human is sitting there. Emulators attack every single one of those assumptions simultaneously. Fraudsters use them to automate synthetic identity abuse, stitching together real and fake info to open dozens of accounts at once. They spoof GPS locations so a login looks like it's coming right from your hometown, and they totally bypass liveness checks by injecting fake digital imagery straight into the app's camera process. And look, this is absolutely not just theoretical. Take a case from June of 2026, reported by the District Court of Amsterdam. One single guy used manipulated images and deepfakes to completely deceive ABMRO's verification process. He successfully opened 47 different bank accounts in other people's names. 47! This proves without a doubt that simple biometric checks, just looking at a face on a screen, are nowhere near enough when an emulator is involved. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer, mind-boggling scale of these operations. IBM Trusteer actually discovered one single emulator farm mimicking over 16,000 compromised customer phones. Let that sink in. 16,000. That means the criminals loaded the precise digital environments of 16,000 different victims onto a single server. They could just industrialize login attempts and drain accounts without ever touching a single physical device belonging to any of those victims. The situation is severe enough that NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, has officially sounded the alarm. They explicitly warned that remote identity processes are highly vulnerable to emulator-driven digital injection attacks and forged meteor attacks. When you've got this kind of threat being called out at the absolute highest levels of global cybersecurity governance, you know for sure it's a systemic crisis, not just some localized glitch. Let's move into Section 3, the economics of scale, and why emulated fraud is absolutely booming right now. You might be wondering, why are criminals flocking to this specific method? Well, as with anything in organized crime, it comes down to the bottom line: The business case for virtual fraud is just incredibly strong. First up, technical commoditization. Because these are standard developer tools, they are ridiculously easy and cheap to get. Second, zero physical logistics. You don't need to print fake IDs, you don't need a shady warehouse full of stolen iPhones, and you don't need to hire low-level money mules. It's all automated. And third, rapid experimentation. Since it's all virtual, fraudsters can cheaply and quickly test thousands of attack profiles and timing patterns until they hit the absolute weakest link in a bank system.
But here's the catch. This ecosystem is constantly evolving. As banks get better at blocking the basic emulators, it creates this incredible evolutionary pressure on the criminals. They started out using obvious emulators. When banks block those, they move to hardened anti-detect environments that strip out obvious virtual signatures. And now? Now they're migrating to highly sophisticated cloud phones and remotely accessible real device farms. They're just constantly moving up the realism curve.
So, Section 4, building a resilient defense. How do we actually stop this industrialization of fraud?
Let's move to and see how this builds into a multi-layered control stack. Blocking known signatures is a good start, sure, but a true defense requires layers. Step 1 is device attestation. This means using tools like Google's Play Integrity API to verify the hardware is genuine and the app hasn't been tampered with. But actually, scratch that. Attestation alone can't stand by itself. Step 2 adds anti-injection controls to validate that a camera feed is originating from a real camera sensor, not a virtual one. And Step 3 is infrastructure analysis. You can't just analyze one isolated transaction. You have to look at the entire behavioral cluster across the network to spot the hidden graph of a massive emulator farm. This entire shift in defense is being pushed heavily by regulatory bodies like ENISA, the European Banking Authority, and the US Federal Reserve. Because the old methods, they have lethal flaws. A simple biometric match is totally vulnerable to injected deepfakes. The resilient alternative there is challenge-response randomness paired with human review. Point-in-time checks, they completely miss the coordination of those emulator farms we talked about. That's why banks need portfolio-level graph analytics. And static rule sets are just a joke to adaptive attackers now, which means real defense requires continuous red team exercises and constant model recalibration.
Which leads us perfectly into Section 5, fighting fire with fire, or how to use simulation defensively.
The most forward-thinking financial institutions out there aren't just building taller walls. They're actively using the enemy's own tools against them. To understand why, we have to talk about adversarial evasion. Research shows that if attackers figure out how your fraud detection model works, they can achieve evasion rates of 60% to 100% just by tweaking their virtual setups. That is a massive, critical vulnerability. Testing your bank's security model against yesterday's fraud pattern is utterly useless if the attackers are actively adapting today. So the solution here is synthetic data. Back in 2024, the UK's Financial Conduct Authority actually highlighted that generating synthetic data using emulators is a completely valid and incredibly powerful way for banks to train their AI. Think about it. If you don't have enough real-world examples of a brand new fraud typology, you use an emulator to simulate it artificially. You generate these fake transaction sequences that replicate highly complex, evasive patterns, and then you feed those right into your machine learning models to make them infinitely smarter.
So the crucial point is this. You have to defend by simulating the attacker, not just the crime itself. FinCrime leaders must embrace defensive emulation. You literally have to stress test your entire security stack against evasive, human-guided, iterative attack behavior. Because if the criminals are testing their attacks on emulators, you absolutely need to be using emulators to test your defenses before they even have a chance to strike.
All right, let's quickly recap the core strategic takeaways from today's explainer. First off, remember that an emulator is a dual-use tool. It's a high-value risk signal, sure, but it is not an automatic guilty verdict. Second, this threat completely blurs the old boundaries, so your defense has to be cross-functional across fraud, AML, and cyber teams. Third, basic device fingerprinting is dead. It is no longer enough to keep an institution safe. And finally, embrace defensive emulation. You have to continuously test your own system's resilience.
I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought. As we plunge deeper and deeper into this digital arms race, the fundamental nature of identity is changing. If a piece of software sitting on a server 1,000 miles away can perfectly fake your physical phone, perfectly spoof your location, and bypass a camera with a deep fake of your face, how will banks, or any institution for that matter, know it's really you tomorrow? It's a massive question, and one we all need to be asking as we navigate this brave new world of digital finance. Thanks for tuning in and keep learning.